The bookstore was nearly silent, its dim light casting soft shadows across the rows of well-worn shelves. I'd been coming here for months, a hidden gem of a place tucked away on the corner of our small town's main street. It was peaceful, unassuming, and felt like a sanctuary from the noise of daily life. And at the center of it all was Walter, the bookstore's owner. Walter was a man of quiet wisdom, with silver hair and a gentle voice that made you feel like he'd seen the world and come back with a story for every wrinkle around his eyes. At 64, he carried a calm that I found magnetic, a serenity that seemed to seep into every inch of the store. I'd gotten to know him gradually, first through small talk over books and, over time, through shared conversations about everything from poetry to the rhythm of life in a small town. It was easy to talk to Walter. He listened in a way that made you feel heard, his gaze steady, his smile kind. Each conversation felt like a moment out of time, a respite that became the highlight of my week. One evening, as the sky outside darkened and the last customers trickled out, I lingered, helping him put away a few stacks of books. It had become a kind of routine, and Walter seemed to welcome the company, the silence between us comfortable. But tonight, there was something different in the air, a quiet intensity that I couldn't quite place. "Thank you for staying late," he said, his voice soft as he looked up from a stack of books. "I know you don't have to, but I appreciate it." I shrugged, giving him a small smile. "It's no trouble. I like being here. It's peaceful." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me a bit longer than usual. "Peaceful," he repeated thoughtfully, as though weighing the word. "I suppose that's what I hoped this place would be, a little escape from the world." I watched him, noting the gentleness in his expression, the way his eyes seemed to hold a quiet sadness that made my heart ache. "You've created something special here," I murmured, unable to look away. "It's more than just a bookstore." For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, charged with something I couldn't name. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I'm glad you think so." There was a vulnerability in his gaze, a softness that felt both intimate and dangerous. My pulse quickened as I realized how close we were standing, the space between us so small that I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the hint of warmth in his gaze. I looked away, my cheeks warming, but I could feel his eyes on me, a quiet intensity that left me breathless. "Can I show you something?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. I looked up, meeting his gaze. "Of course." He gestured for me to follow him to the back of the store, past the rows of bookshelves and into a small, cozy reading nook I hadn't noticed before. There was a leather armchair, well-worn and comfortable, a small table with a single reading lamp casting a soft glow. The space felt private, hidden away from the rest of the world. "This is my favorite part of the store," he said, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "It's where I go to think." I smiled, taking in the warmth of the room. "It's lovely." He nodded, his gaze soft as he looked around. "I thought you might like it. You seem to appreciate the quiet moments, the stillness." His words resonated with me in a way I couldn't quite explain, and for a moment I felt a strange closeness to him, a connection that went beyond our shared love of books. We stood there in silence, the air thick with unspoken words, and I found myself drawn to him in a way I hadn't expected. "Walter," I murmured, my voice trembling slightly, "thank you for this, for letting me see this side of you." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of warmth and something else, something that made my heart race. "Thank you for being here," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time since I've had someone to share this with." The vulnerability in his voice, the quiet sadness in his eyes, tugged at something deep inside me. I wanted to reach out to comfort him, but I hesitated, unsure of what to say, afraid of crossing a line that felt dangerously close. We stood there in the soft glow of the reading lamp, the silence between us filled with a tension I couldn't ignore. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against mine. The touch was soft, almost accidental, but it sent a shiver through me, a warmth that spread through my chest. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and saw the same tension reflected in his eyes, the same unspoken desire that left me breathless. I knew in that moment that something had shifted between us, something that neither of us could deny. But as much as I wanted to close the distance between us, to give in to the quiet longing that had been building between us, I felt a wave of uncertainty, a hesitation born of the boundaries that lay between us. He was older, wiser, a man who had lived a life full of stories I could only imagine. And yet, in that moment, he felt closer to me than anyone ever had. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely audible, his gaze searching mine. I nodded, my heart pounding as I took a step closer, my hand reaching out to touch his arm. The warmth of his skin beneath my fingers sent a thrill through me, a feeling of intimacy that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. He smiled, a small, hesitant smile that made my heart ache, and as he lifted his hand to cup my cheek, I closed my eyes, savoring the softness of his touch, the gentleness in his gaze. For a moment, everything else faded away, leaving only the quiet intensity of the connection between us. But as much as I wanted to lose myself in that moment, I couldn't ignore the quiet voice in the back of my mind, the voice that reminded me of the boundaries we were crossing, the line we were towing with each lingering touch, each shared glance. I pulled back slightly, my cheeks warm, my heart racing as I looked up at him. "Walter, I don't know what this means." He nodded, his gaze filled with understanding. "Neither do I," he murmured, his voice soft. "But I know that. Being here with you, it feels right. It feels like something I haven't felt in a long time." His words sent a shiver through me, a thrill that made my heart pound, and I knew, in that moment, that I felt the same way. There was something undeniable between us, something that went beyond words, a connection that had been building slowly, quietly, in the spaces between our conversations, in the glances we shared across the store. Without thinking, I reached out, my fingers intertwining with his as I looked up at him, my gaze steady. "I don't want this to end," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and hesitation, and I could see the struggle in his gaze, the internal conflict that mirrored my own. But as he tightened his grip on my hand, as he leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, I knew that we were both standing on the edge of something we couldn't ignore. We stayed like that for a long moment, our breaths mingling in the small space between us, the warmth of his touch grounding me, soothing the doubts that lingered in my mind. And then, slowly, as if guided by some invisible force, he leaned down, his lips brushing softly against mine. The kiss was tentative, a gentle question, a quiet plea, and as I kissed him back, my heart racing, I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling of rightness that I couldn't explain. We stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, lost in the softness of the moment, the quiet intensity of a connection that felt both forbidden and undeniable. When we finally pulled away, both of us breathless, he looked at me, his gaze filled with a mixture of love and vulnerability that made my heart ache. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't mean to, but I couldn't stop myself." I shook my head, a small smile tugging at my lips. Neither could I. The days that followed were filled with a strange, thrilling tension, a feeling that seemed to linger in the quiet corners of the bookstore and in every glance Walter and I shared. Each moment felt charged, every exchange a reminder of the connection that now bound us. We didn't speak of that night, of the kiss we'd shared in the reading nook, but the memory hung between us, unspoken but palpable, a warmth that wrapped around us whenever we were alone. I found myself drawn to him, seeking out reasons to linger, to stay behind after closing time, to savor the quiet hours that belonged only to us. And he welcomed it, his eyes lighting up each time he saw me, a silent acknowledgement of the bond we'd discovered. One evening, as the last few customers left and the bookstore grew still, I lingered by the register, organizing some stray receipts just as an excuse to stay. Walter watched me from across the room, a small smile playing on his lips as he finished stacking a pile of books. "Seems like you're always finding reasons to help me close up," he said, his voice warm with amusement. I looked up, feeling my cheeks warm as I met his gaze. "Maybe I just like the quiet," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't the whole truth. He nodded, his smile softening. "I like it too, especially when you're here." There was a pause, a moment where neither of us spoke, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I could feel my heart racing, my pulse quickening as he took a step closer, his gaze holding mine with a quiet intensity that left me breathless. Would you like to join me for a cup of tea?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just for a bit." I nodded, unable to find the words to answer. He led me to the small back office, a cozy space filled with books and mementos that told the story of his life. There was an old kettle on the desk, a few mismatched mugs, and a jar of loose tea leaves. He moved with practiced ease, filling the kettle and setting it on the small stove in the corner. As we waited for the water to heat, he looked at me, his gaze soft, filled with a warmth that made my heart ache. "You know, it's been a long time since I've shared this space with someone," he murmured, almost as if he were talking to himself. I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone here. I reached out, my hand finding his as I gave it a gentle squeeze. "I'm glad I can be here with you," I said softly, the words feeling both simple and profound. He looked down at our joined hands, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that felt both intimate and natural. The kettle began to whistle, breaking the silence, and he pulled away to pour the tea, his movements careful, almost reverent. We sipped our tea in silence, the quiet of the room filled with a comfortable warmth. I could feel his gaze on me, a quiet intensity that sent a thrill through me, but I kept my eyes on my cup, afraid that if I looked up, I'd lose myself in the depths of his gaze. "Tell me," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "What brought you to this town? I've always wondered." I smiled, feeling a familiar warmth spread through me at his question. "I suppose I was looking for a change," I replied, my gaze drifting to the small collection of books on his desk. I wanted to get away from the noise, to find a place where I could breathe. He nodded, a small, understanding smile playing on his lips. "I understand that. This place, it has a way of bringing peace, of offering solace to those who seek it." Our eyes met, and in that moment, I felt as though he could see right through me, as though he understood the parts of me that I'd never spoken out loud. The quiet connection between us deepened, a feeling that went beyond words, and as he reached across the table, his hand covering mine, I felt my heart race. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "For being here." Before I could respond, he leaned forward, his lips brushing softly against my cheek in a gesture that was both gentle and possessive. I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth of his touch, the softness of his lips as they lingered against my skin. The kiss was tender, a silent promise, a quiet confession of everything we couldn't say out loud. And as he pulled back, his gaze holding mine with a mixture of longing and vulnerability, I felt a thrill run through me, a feeling that left me breathless. "Walter," I whispered, my voice trembling. I don't know what to say." He smiled, his thumb brushing softly over the back of my hand. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Just be here with me." We stayed like that for a long moment, our hands intertwined, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he leaned in once more, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both gentle and intense. The kiss deepened, our connection growing stronger with each passing second, and I felt myself melting into him, surrendering to the quiet passion that had been building between us. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a feeling of completeness that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. We broke apart only when we were both breathless, our foreheads resting together as we struggled to catch our breath. His hands lingered on my waist, his grip firm but gentle, and I looked up at him, seeing the same mixture of emotions that I felt mirrored in his eyes. This is more than I ever expected," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. I didn't think I'd feel this way again." I reached up, my hand cupping his cheek as I looked into his eyes, my heart full. "Neither did I murmured, my voice trembling, "but I'm glad I do." We stayed there in the quiet of his office, wrapped in each other's arms, savoring the warmth of our connection, the unspoken promises that lingered between us. And as the night wore on, as the world outside grew dark and silent, I knew that this was more than just a fleeting moment, more than a passing attraction. This was something real, something profound, a connection that had been waiting for us to find it. But as the days passed, as our relationship grew deeper, I felt a quiet fear creeping into the corners of my heart, a worry that this happiness was too fragile, too precious to last. We were from different worlds, separated by years and experiences, and though our connection felt unbreakable, I couldn't shake the doubt that lingered at the edges of my mind. And I knew, deep down, that he felt it too. One evening, as we sat in the reading nook, our fingers intertwined, he looked at me, his gaze filled with a sadness that made my heart ache. "I never thought I'd find this again," he murmured, his voice trembling. "But sometimes I wonder if it's fair, if I'm asking too much." His words cut through me, a painful reminder of the reality we'd been trying so hard to ignore. I tightened my grip on his hand, my heart racing as I searched for the right words. "Walter, this is real. Whatever this is between us, it's real," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know that. I don't want to lose this." He nodded, his gaze filled with a mixture of love and regret. "Neither do I," he murmured. "But sometimes, love isn't enough." We sat there in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on us, both of us grappling with the complexity of our emotions. And as I looked at him, as I saw the quiet strength in his gaze, I knew that, no matter what happened, he would always hold a piece of my heart. In the end, our love was both a gift and a burden, a reminder of all that life could offer and all that it could take away. And as we sat there in the quiet of the bookstore, wrapped in each other's arms, I knew that we would face whatever came next together, bound by a love that went beyond words, a love that had found us in the quiet moments, in the stolen glances, in the spaces between. The weeks that followed felt like a dream, each day carrying us deeper into a world that belonged only to us. Our love blossomed in the quiet corners of the bookstore, in shared glances across the aisles, in the soft touches that spoke louder than words. The age gap, the whispers of doubt, all faded whenever we were together, replaced by a connection that felt as if it had been waiting for us to discover it all along. But as time wore on, the weight of reality began to settle in, casting a shadow over the happiness we had found. I saw it in his eyes during those moments when we held each other in silence, a quiet sadness that hinted at the inner conflict he tried so hard to hide. I felt it too, a subtle tension, a nagging voice reminding me of the world outside our haven, a world where this love might not be so easily accepted. One evening, as we were closing up, Walter pulled me aside, his expression soft but troubled. We sat together in the reading nook, his hand enveloping mine, the warmth of his touch a stark contrast to the sadness in his gaze. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice low, as if afraid to break the fragile peace we'd built around ourselves. "I've thought about this, about us, more than you know. And as much as I want this, want us, I wonder if I'm holding you back, asking you to live a life that isn't fair to you." His words sent a pang through me, and I tightened my grip on his hand, a desperate attempt to hold on to him, to us. "Walter, you're not holding me back," I said softly, my voice trembling. "You've given me so much, more than I ever thought I'd find. I don't care about what anyone else thinks. This, what we have, it's real." He looked at me, a mixture of love and sorrow in his eyes. "You're young," he whispered, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. "There's so much ahead of you, so much ahead of you, so much life to live. And I worry that I'm asking too much of you, asking you to give up things you deserve." A tear slipped down my cheek and I leaned forward, resting my forehead against his. "Walter, I don't want a life without you. I don't care about age or any of it. I want you." He closed his eyes, his hand lifting to cup my cheek as he held me close. For a long moment, we sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, holding on to the love that had brought us together. But even as we held each other, I could feel the quiet resignation in his embrace, the knowledge that, despite our love, we couldn't ignore the challenges that lay ahead. The following days were filled with a bittersweet tenderness, each moment carrying the weight of what we both knew was coming. We clung to each other in the quiet moments, savoring the connection that had brought us together, but there was a sense of finality in his touch, a gentleness that felt like a goodbye. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the bookstore filled with the soft glow of twilight, Walter took my hand, his gaze filled with a quiet determination. "I want you to promise me something," he murmured, his voice steady. "Promise me that, no matter what happens, you'll live a life full of love, that you'll seek happiness in every corner of the world, even if it's not here with me." I felt my heart break at his words, the quiet acceptance of the goodbye he was giving me. I wanted to argue, to plead with him to stay, but as I looked into his eyes, I saw the depth of his love, a love that was willing to let go if it meant I'd find happiness. With tears streaming down my cheeks, I nodded, my voice a whisper. I promise." He pulled me into his arms, holding me close, and in that moment, I knew that this was our farewell, that he was giving me the freedom to live a life without the weight of our differences, without the burden of what we couldn't change. We shared one last kiss, a kiss filled with all the love and longing we'd held for each other, a kiss that was both a beginning and an end. And as we pulled away, both of us breathless, I felt a peace settle over me, a quiet acceptance of the love we had found and the goodbye we had chosen. In the days that followed, I left the bookstore, carrying with me the memories of the love we'd shared, a love that had been both a gift and a lesson, a reminder of the beauty that could be found in the quiet moments, in the spaces between. Though we were no longer together, though the world had pulled us apart, I knew that a part of him would stay with me always, a quiet presence that lived in the pages of every book, in the soft glow of every reading lamp, in the warmth of every whispered word. And as I moved forward, as I sought out new places, new experiences, I kept my promise, carrying with me the memory of a love that had taught me what it meant to truly be seen, to truly be loved.